slave breeding.
Were slaves in America really bred for strength?
On the other hand, however, the planters preferred their slaves to be male, and only about a third of those exported were women. That's huge. Some of your favorite YouTube historians have neither heard of nor mentioned this book. The mothers were Indians.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up out of your sleep.
Slave trade history is greatly misunderstood. One of the most important plot devices in the mainstream narrative of British slavery in North America is the idea of slave breeding. The gist of it is that since Europeans were getting rich in agribusiness using African slave labor, it behooved slave owners to force their African slaves to have children to perpetuate their unpaid workforce. The most egregious way to accomplish this was to SA the enslaved African women. We're talking about the R word now. But the problem is that this part of the story has been told inaccurately, starting with the fact that the vast majority of all enslaved women in North America were American Indians. Furthermore, while a lot of them were genuinely victims of the R word, a traumatic tragedy that likely defiled those bloodlines with generational curses, it may not have happened quite that way very often. We're going to be respectful in broaching such a sensitive subject, but in order for you to make sense of what I'm saying, we're going to need to dive into the numbers. We're going to need to revisit the slave trade demography that we investigated back in January 2025. Andrina Crockett is the founder and CEO of the Georgetown African American Historic Landmark Project and Tour. The organization has established a lot of plaques in Maryland, but for years they've been trying to get a monument built to better commemorate the descendants of transatlantic slave trade survivors. In her testimony on the subject, addressing the National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission, she argued, quote, "A plaque would not serve to commemorate the 388,747 Africans who survived the voyage to mainland North America, nor the 42 million descendants currently living in the United States who need to heal," end quote. That's the federally recognized number, 388,747 slaves. That's why she used this number when petitioning a federal agency for funding, and you'll notice she attributes the estimated 42 million some odd African Americans in the U.S. today to those 388,747 ancestors. The mainstream narrative is that we are all descendants of those few. If you base your argument on the premise that the federal government has already acknowledged in public forums and legislation, you can twist their arm to make them acknowledge the truth in that argument. It took them from 1619 all the way to 1866 to bring all 388,747 slaves to North America. Yet the 1860 census recorded 4.4 million colored people already, more than 10 times the number they brought here. How is that possible? The mainstream answer is that there was an unprecedented birth rate among these slaves that grew the population super rapidly. Why? Because of slave breeding. Now, I know that this is a highly emotional subject for our people. To think that our ancestors were raped by their slave masters or barbarically forced to mate with each other without a choice is excruciatingly infuriating. I writhe in agony with you over this horrific prospect, but I need you to be aware that scholars are not united in the idea that it genuinely happened. Granted, maybe they're just looking for any way to absolve themselves of the guilt and shame of the institution of slavery, but we have to be willing to at least recognize that the proposed slave breeding industry is a theory, not a fact. You might wonder why we even need to talk about this. The reason this is so important is because if slave breeding turned out to be a myth, or even just exaggerated, this would leave us with no explanation for how there were already 4.4 million colored people by 1860. Well, almost no explanation. The one remaining explanation would be that all those colored people had actually already been here and that they were simply being added to the census little by little with each decade as their lands were being annexed by the U.S. government. The couple I'm showing you is Ned and Constance Sublett, two liberal white authors who channeled their white guilt productively by telling our story for us, which is ironically what colonizers do to the subaltern even when they call themselves being helpful. They wrote a book entitled The American Slave Coast. It's literally over 700 pages detailing the economics of the slave breeding industry. This book was published in 2015 and actually won the American Book Award the following year. Then there's Jonathan B. Pritchett, a historian at Tulane University who specifically specializes in the economic history of slavery. Yes, another white man, but he's a real expert. Pritchett reviewed the award-winning book a year after it had already won that award. His review was published in the Journal of Economic History. And while some of your favorite YouTube historians have neither heard of nor mentioned this book or the review, Pritchett's book review actually made serious waves in the world of academic historians. And I think all so-called African Americans need to read it. We're going to read a quote from the book, and then we're going to read Pritchett's reaction to that quote in his own review of that book. From page 362 of said book, quote, "Prohibiting the African slave trade protected the market so that a new class of American traders could come forward, supplied with homegrown captives born into slavery on Virginia and Maryland farms. The conditions were ripe for a massive forced migration of enslaved Chesapeake laborers down south, and it did not have to be a one-time drain. A continuing domestic slave breeding industry was now possible." End quote. So the context is that right when cotton became the dominant cash crop, Britain outlawed the international slave trade, cutting off supply. So slave demand went up, as did slave prices. Ned and Constance are telling us that slave traders in the Chesapeake region reacted to this by pivoting to breeding the slaves that they already had, so that they'd get more children to sell to southern plantations. Now we can read what Pritchett had to say about this premise. Quote, "Despite its 700 plus page length, the American Slave Coast does not include a comprehensive review of the literature on slave breeding. Many of the authors who deny or minimize the economic importance of slave breeding are not discussed in the text. For example, the Subletts do not discuss Robert Fogel and Stanley Ingerman's time on the cross, nor, for that matter, do they discuss the works of Winthrop Collins or Elsie Gray. The slave breeding industry is a controversial subject, and many scholars have questioned its existence. Many scholars have questioned its existence. Consider U.B. Phillips, American Negro Slavery, page 361, quote, "It has been said by various anti-slavery spokesmen that many slave owners systematically bred slaves for the market. They have adduced no shred of supporting evidence, however. A lack of supporting evidence led scholars to conclude that slaveholders rarely bred slaves for sale. Because the American Slave Coast omits their research, the Subletts provide an incomplete literature review of slave breeding." End quote. So Pritchett calls Ned and Constance out on the fact that their book didn't actually show any proof of research to back up its own claims. He also calls them out on the fact that the book doesn't address the works of other researchers who have argued that slave breeding wasn't actually prolific enough to constitute a so-called industry. Those researchers provide reasons why the concept should be treated with skepticism. But the Subletts give us no reasons to believe in the mainstream narrative of slave breeding. The biggest takeaway from this is the fact that he also confirms that many academic historians have concluded that slave breeding was uncommon. That's huge. because it would be impossible for our population to increase more than tenfold in the time frame allotted without this slave breeding industry. The mainstream narrative actually depends on it, which I've explained in previous presentations.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
Here's the coup de grace. You remember J. David Hacker? He's that demographic historian who published the 2020 study I did a whole video on back in January 2025. One of the wildest parts of that study was the part where he said in no uncertain terms, quote, slave birth rates in the 19th century were very high, near a biological maximum for a human population. End quote. So an expert is telling you that this slave population in the 1800s grew faster than almost any human population ever has in recorded history. He was saying we lack precedents for this kind of growth. We don't need to get bogged down in the math. The point of this is that an expert historian who works with math and statistics for a living said our ancestors would have had to procreate at a rate that possibly exceeds the birth rates of any other known human population in history. There's no way we could have done that if slave breeding didn't happen, or even if the slave breeding narrative has been exaggerated. That biologically maximal growth rate depends largely on industrial slave breeding to mass-produce slaves. And the kicker is that J. David Hacker arrived at his conclusion without even considering one additional key fact, which we can find in Encyclopedia Britannica. Quote, on the other hand, however, the planters preferred their slaves to be male, and only about a third of those exported were women. Thus, since Western African men who could afford it were polygynous, the birth rate may have been less affected by the birth rate may have been less affected than might have been expected. End quote. So not only did this small African slave population outpace most or all human populations in history, we did so with a massive gender disparity. On top of that, don't get me wrong, I actually do believe slave masters raped slaves pretty often, and I'm sure there were births that resulted from this. In fact, I have proof of this in more than one branch of my paternal tree. However, what little slave breeding we can verify was often forcing male and female slaves together rather than the slave owner forcing himself on a slave. And where do you think those female slaves came from? Because Encyclopedia Britannica tells us they didn't come from Africa. These African men, therefore, would have had to procreate with indigenous women. And they were being added to a slave workforce that was already entirely Aboriginal in the first place. Make no mistake, slave trade numbers don't work without black people being American Indians. The mothers were Indians.
We're slaves in America, really bred for strength. And is that a reason why black athletes often dominate today? It's a common notion, and it's accepted as reality in many locker rooms and YouTube comments. In fact, the most popular video I ever produced is about why black athletes do so well in so many sports. I didn't include slavery as a factor, and I got a lot of comments behind what seems like a common sense explanation. Many people my age remember that in 1988, Jimmy the Greek, a popular CBS sports commentator, said out loud what a lot of people assumed was true. He said that black athletes were, quote, better to begin with because he's been bred to be that way. Because of his high thighs and big thighs, they can jump higher and run faster. The slave owner would breed his big black to his big woman so he could have a big black kid. That's where it all started. By the next day, Jimmy was out of a job, with CBS calling his comments reprehensible. But were they true? A lot of people believe it. A lot of black athletes certainly believe it. So the elephant in the room is this. Is that a reality or a myth? Hey, I'm Ken LaCourte. I researched this heavily, and I'll explain what I learned as straightforward as I can. When the United States banned the importation of new slaves in 1808, you might think it would be the beginning of the end of American slavery. But in reality, it transformed it into something darker. With the external supply cut off, slaveholders turned inward, recognizing that enslaved women's fertility was essential to their future. Enslaved women's fertility was essential to their future. Enslaved women's fertility was essential to their future. To them it was clear. The bodies of slave women now held far more value than their labor alone. To them it was clear. The bodies of slave women now held far more value than their labor alone. The bodies of slave women now held far more value than their labor alone.